Hello and welcome to Doing Philosophy. I'm Tom Kaspers. You're listening to the last episode of what I've been calling my experiment with this format. If you've been with me throughout the 3 previous episodes, I want to thank you for investing your time. I know that it might not have always been easy listening, but I do hope that this current episode will give you a return on your investment. If the previous episodes were a bit dry and austere, I promise you that this one will contain some fun, freewheeling contemplations about the nature of philosophy, filled with juicy details offered by my 2 interviewees, Crispin Wright and Sanford Goldberg. You've already heard from them in the previous episodes, so I won't reintroduce them to you, but I will quickly sketch the starting point of this episode, so you're all caught up. In the previous episodes, I've introduced this distinction between personal and shared inquiry. An example of personal inquiry is inquiry into matters of taste, whereas scientific inquiry is a paragon of shared inquiry. I've argued that shared inquiry aims for truth, whereas personal inquiry doesn't. When we engage in personal inquiry, all we need to do is ensure that our beliefs and opinions are internally coherent. But the structure we thereby create needn't be shareable. Instead, it's characterized by what I've called these personal nodes, like aesthetic predilections or fundamental moral convictions. But when we engage in shared inquiry, we want to pool our resources and base our beliefs exclusively on shared evidence. And that's why we don't have these personal nodes. Instead, we aim toward a structure of beliefs that is in principle shareable, that's interpersonal. I've shown how this difference plays out with respect to peer disagreement. In personal inquiry, we may rationally remain steadfast as long as our opponent's arguments don't threaten the internal coherence of our beliefs. Whereas in shared inquiry, it is rational to conciliate in the face of peer disagreement. And I've argued that this distinction between personal and shared inquiry explains the differences in testimony in, for example, science and aesthetics. What I want to do in this episode is argue that philosophy is mostly a personal inquiry. I say mostly because the doctrine we loosely call philosophy is in reality a mixed bag of all kinds of different topics and traditions. So while I'll be talking about philosophy in general, I don't mean to suggest that what I say applies to everything we call philosophy. You can decide for yourself whether the kind of philosophy you take yourself to be doing fits the bill or not. Okay, those were the preliminaries. Now let me start defending my claim that philosophical inquiry is personal instead of shared. And I know that you are likely to disagree with this claim. Perhaps because you're a naturalist and you believe that philosophy is methodologically similar to science, or just because even though you appreciate the dissimilarities between philosophy and science, you might still believe that the goals and methods of philosophy are much more like scientific inquiry than inquiry into matters of taste. So I'll start by pointing out some initial problems with the conception of philosophy as a shared inquiry, like science. These problems have to do with systemic disagreement. I know some people believe that the extent to which we disagree in philosophy has been overblown, and that the extent to which scientists disagree has been underestimated. But it does seem that a consensus is much more easily achieved in science than it is in philosophy, especially when it comes to basic scientific facts, like the fact that the mean wingspan of the Andean condor is 283 centimeters. In comparison, there aren't many straightforward philosophical facts. Even the very notion sounds weird. Philosophers deal in theories, not in facts, and these theories are almost always disputed. I've argued that conciliation in the face of peer disagreement is rational when inquiry is shared. So if philosophical inquiry is indeed shared, the result of systemic peer disagreement is that the philosopher couldn't rationally believe any of the theories they propound. Now, it might surprise you that there are lots of philosophers that actually agree with this thought, that philosophers just couldn't rationally believe any of their theories. Goldberg is one of these philosophers. I asked him if this isn't problematic, and that it would be much more useful to remain steadfast in philosophy. Goldberg referred back to this when formulating what he thinks is a way around the problem.
You actually put it very nicely when you said steadfastness can be useful in philosophy rather than that the steadfast response is rational. I sometimes think that the way to think about philosophy is like the way to think about science, namely, we don't want to focus our rationality assessments only at the level of the individual philosopher, the individual scientist or scientific team. That what can be irrational for the individual can be rational overall for the community. This is a point that Philip Kitcher made. Many people have made this in philosophy of science, but the person who first brought it to my attention was Kitcher, and I think something similar is true in philosophy as well. I don't think we should believe our theories, and that's in part for the reason that you talked about earlier, namely, there's just so much disagreement. And for any view that I hold, I can identify a smarter philosopher who knows at least as much as I do who disagrees with me. For any view that I hold, I'm pretty confident I can say that. And it would be the height of chutzpah, as we say, for me to think that, oh, well, I've got it right and they all have it wrong. So, how do you combine the usefulness of steadfastness with that view? Well, what is going to be irrational at an individual level can be great for the overall state of philosophy. So, if you can think about your relationship to your view, and my thought is that systematic disagreement suggests that we all ought to be skeptical or much less confident that we have it right, not confident enough to have justified beliefs. So then, what is our relationship to our views? Well, at the very least, I'm trying to think of an attitude that is the attitudinal correlate of what championing is as an activity. So if you think about what it is to champion something, it's to take it on and to try to defend it and promote it in certain areas. And what I've been trying to think about when I think about these things are what are the epistemic and professional and ethical constraints on championing. You can't just champion anything. In fact, there are some times when if you champion something, you can be called out for bad ethics. I think that's absolutely true. But it turns out that when it comes to the epistemic constraints on championing, you can champion a lot and not do so unjustifiably more than you can say, believe something. The epistemic constraints on belief are rather robust. The epistemic constraints on championing are much less robust. And I think that's in part because we want to be able to have a community where we can pursue things in wide recognition of how we live in an epistemic desert in philosophy. We're not likely to acquire knowledge, and that's the reason why I think you can have championing, as I call it.
So Goldberg argues we can't actually believe our theories, but that's all right because we can still champion our theories. And so we can keep playing the game of philosophy. I say game because Goldberg thinks that philosophy is indeed very much like a game.
I've sometimes thought that philosophy has as much to do with a kind of intellectual, what I would describe as serious intellectual play. It is serious in the sense that we ultimately do care about truth. And ultimately, if someone can point out that an implication of my theory has a that an implication of my theory is false, that is a bad-making feature of the theory. And you do get this from time to time in epistemology, especially epistemology that engages with cognitive science. You get this in philosophy of language, especially the kind of philosophy of language that engages with cognitive science. That can be a real criticism, but at the same time, it's a kind of play. It's a kind of play in that the constraints are significantly weaker than they are when we're doing direct observation of the world, when we have very, very clear predictions made by two rival theories, as you sometimes get in empirical sciences. So I don't know if that's a clear response to your question, but that gives you a sense of my alternative picture about philosophy.
Interestingly, Wright also mentions this conception of philosophy as a game, but he puts it in a more negative light when I asked him whether philosophers can rationally believe their own theories.
I'll give you a pragmatic answer. I think they should behave as though they do, because the way we make progress, if we ever do, is by defending a view against all comers, the kind of trial by ordeal. And maybe in order to do that, resourcefully and skillfully, you need to believe. You need a conviction. This is on the right lines. Otherwise, it just becomes a kind of game, like playing chess in a context where you have no real interest in winning. So yes, that's not the answer I think you were looking for. There's a sense of should you believe in which presupposes that there's something that you ought to believe. Okay, so in answering yes to that question, you'd be taking it that you've got it right. But firstly, getting it right is as we've seen in our discussion, a fragile notion in this context. And secondly, if you've done this stuff for any length of time, you must realize that whatever views you find attractive, there'll be a defense of a view you don't find attractive that contradicts it, okay, which may not be bulletproof exactly, but it will be resourceful and challenging to say what's wrong with it. So you shouldn't be super confident in philosophy, I don't think. I'm always mistrustful of philosophers who think that some things are definite mistakes. Some views are beyond the pale, and I think, how could you think that when just sociologically, when you're confronted with examples of very skillful, respectable philosophers holding views which you can't see off and which strike you as dotty. One of the most traditional benefits of philosophy, according to Socrates, is coming to realize how little you know. And I'd qualify the expression of that, coming to realize that in philosophy, you can be confident that you have the right opinion about very little, or the best opinion about very little. There's always an antagonism, and a trained, skillful philosopher can always construct a case for a view you find uncongenial. Williamson on vagueness, Lewis on modality, Graham Priest on contradiction. All these views are, as I put it before, dotty. Okay, in my opinion. But nevertheless, you have to be impressed by the way in which they're defended and worked through, and generalized. That's good philosophy. So the sense, I think it's valuable to know that can happen and is likely to happen about any particular philosophical issue. That's a kind of wisdom. And it's just, in keeping with Socrates' thought, that you realize that the views you're attracted to are matched by views you find unattractive, but which are as well or better defended. Yeah. That's a truth of sorts.
So both Goldberg and Wright believe might not be the right term here. After all, we're doing philosophy as we speak. But they champion the idea that philosophers couldn't be very confident in their own theories, that such confidence would be unforgivably arrogant, given the presence of systemic peer disagreement. But I want to pick up on that remark of Wright on philosophy just being a game, where we have no interest in winning. I think that if we don't aspire to be in a position where we can believe our theories, and if we're content with just championing them instead, it seems that we no longer have any skin in the game, and that philosophy becomes this purely intellectual game, a way for intelligent people to showcase their intelligence, but nothing more. I think that would be a very sad state. I know that nothing is more controversial than to argue against the Socratic wisdom that we can only know how little we know. This kind of skepticism is deemed to be highly virtuous in philosophical circles. But I think that the times have changed. We've come to realize that many philosophical debates aren't just matters of intellectual curiosity. We shouldn't applaud ourselves for our intellectual humility when we endlessly suspend judgment. In my mind, that's not humility at all, it's stupidity. We can't just keep playing our philosophical games as if absolutely nothing is at stake. We need philosophical beliefs to guide us in virtually every aspect of life. And it's not just ethical beliefs. The scientist, for instance, needs philosophical beliefs about how to best carry out their inquiry. In politics, we appeal to metaphysical beliefs about the nature of gender or about whether an embryo constitutes life. Epistemologists can help us understand how echo chambers are formed. There are countless of other examples. I think of my own field, philosophy of truth, which I think can contribute to our understanding of the post-truth crisis and alternative facts. But how can we make any of these contributions if we don't even believe our own theories? I think it's almost a kind of intellectual dishonesty not to believe our own preaching. And you certainly can't blame others for not taking us seriously if we can't even do so ourselves. So I suppose that's one problem when we treat philosophy as a shared inquiry. We can't rationally believe our own theories. But there's another, somewhat related problem, and that is that there doesn't seem to be much progress in philosophy, given that there's so much disagreement. Now, I must say that this depends on our interpretation of progress. If we think of progress as the accumulation of knowledge, then the fact that we couldn't rationally believe our theories will certainly get in the way of progress. But you could also think of progress as the accumulation of understanding and argue that there could sometimes be understanding even in the absence of knowledge. In that case, there could maybe be progress even when we end up disagreeing more instead of less, because it could then be the case that at least a small portion of the community developed some measure of understanding that was previously lost on everyone. But I think the problem is more basic than this, which is that if inquiry is shared, then whatever our idea of progress will consist in, our aim for it will be a collective aim. So systemic disagreement will be a sign that large parts of the community have not yet achieved this aim. Even if there would still be room for some progress, the mere presence of systemic disagreement tells us that our collective condition would be suboptimal. So to conclude, if philosophy is a shared inquiry, the state of the discipline is, well, a bit of a mess. Nobody can rationally believe their own theories, and whatever philosophical progress might amount to, we have a reason to be quite pessimistic about what our discipline has accomplished thus far. And I think this pessimistic outlook has some real-life consequences, because people do in fact compare philosophy to science, and they do think that we've made a mess of things. So they aren't terribly inclined to invest in philosophical research, because compared to science, we almost never establish any meaningful results. And when it comes to various debates about important societal matters, philosophers are often denied a seat at the table. Perhaps because of the thought, why should we believe anything you're saying when you can't even bring yourself to believe it? I think these are at least initial reasons for reconsidering this comparison to science and to re-examine the goals of philosophy. But this is where I will slightly shift my focus. I've now given you reasons to, as it were, want to believe that philosophical inquiry is personal instead of shared. But you will almost certainly have reasons to resist this as well, reasons that I think are built on the intuitions that when we do philosophy, we try to describe reality, just like science, and that truth matters a great deal to us in philosophy. Maybe so much so that we would rather be miserable because we know that we will perpetually fail in satisfying these ambitions than to give up on such ambitions altogether. But here's where I will argue that these intuitions don't actually align with the way we carry out our philosophical practices. Although it might at first seem like they do, it might seem as if philosophy is indeed collaborative, just like science. I asked Goldberg whether he thinks it is.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I can only give a tentative answer to this because even though I've been thinking about it since you sent me the email asking me this, I don't think I've reached any firm conclusions on this. I think there are parts of philosophy that look collaborative. I'll give an example in a second. And there are parts of philosophy that look not entirely collaborative, at least not in the way that science is. So here's a part of philosophy that to my mind looks collaborative. We present our results in conferences. I don't think that's just because we like to go to fancy places, although we do like to go to fancy places. I think I'm being honest with myself, and it's not just something that I tell my life partner so that she doesn't get upset with me when I travel yet again. I think I'm being honest with myself when I say that I'm not sure how confident I'm entitled to be until I present my work in venues where I can anticipate the best philosophical minds around. And that's because I do think that that's a way we have of collaborating. It may not look like it when when people are trying to fling objections at you from the audience, but it's a way of keeping us in touch with kinds of evidence to which we might not have access in our own departments when we go back to our own home universities. And in this sense, I think that is collaborative. Even though it looks almost like we're confronting one another with objections, I actually think that's part of the collaborative nature of philosophy. And that, I think, is probably not entirely unlike science. The part that's much less like science, I think, is there is something to the idea, and I think this goes back at least to Descartes, and it wouldn't surprise me if it goes back further, with thinking that I want to get clear in my own mind about how I take things to stand. I think that's much less interesting, important, and valuable in science than it is in philosophy. I don't quite know why it's valuable in philosophy, but I will tell you I have the intuition that it is, and that's the way in which I think philosophy is a little bit less like science. So there's a very quick and dirty characterization of one way in which we're like science, one way in which we're less like science.
So I think the way in which Goldberg thinks philosophy is collaborative is entirely in keeping with the idea that it is a personal inquiry. And that's because philosophical theories can get incredibly complex, and it's very hard to tell whether your theory is internally coherent. Every philosopher will remember a time where they thought their theory was more or less bulletproof, and then they found out at a conference or from feedback from a peer reviewer that they overlooked some glaring mistake. These moments are embarrassing, and they make us humble. So when we first encounter disagreement, we may well believe that our theory probably isn't as coherent as we had first taken it to be. But once we work through these disagreements, we might find that they don't actually threaten the internal coherence of our theories. It's just that they offer different pictures that may be equally internally coherent. And once we've done that, we may regain some of our confidence. This is a very arduous process, but that's all right, because philosophical beliefs shouldn't be cheap. But this wouldn't take away from the fact that it is in principle possible to rationally believe a philosophical theory in the face of systemic disagreement. And here I must note that when we do go to these conferences and we face disagreement, it's often seen as a virtue, a sign of a good philosopher, if they are able to stick to their theories in spite of all the objections they face. The response to disagreement in philosophy is usually not one of conciliation at all, it's one of entrenchment. And while it is undeniably bad practice to stick to a theory that's unsalvageable, we don't think it's bad philosophical practice to stick with a theory that can still be made to cohere, even if almost every other philosopher rejects the theory as being incredibly counterintuitive. Some of those we generally deem to be the very best minds in philosophy are known for supporting wacky, or as Wright would say, dotty theories that many of us would consider to be in violation of plain common sense. So that's the way in which philosophy can be collaborative. But I also wanted to talk about the way that, according to Goldberg, it isn't collaborative, which was that point going back at least to Descartes, that philosophers should get clear in their own minds on how things stand. This, I think, is how the mechanics of testimony are importantly similar to aesthetic testimony and dissimilar to scientific testimony. I asked Goldberg whether he agrees that in philosophy, just like for matters of taste, we must individually corroborate beliefs we gain from testimony.
Yeah, I think there's something right about that. And that goes back to the point I made earlier that I acknowledged without being able to explain, which is there's something to being able to see for yourself how you see things for yourself. That's true in philosophy, and it's not as true in science. And your hypothesis, which I think is a plausible one, is the very coming to have the insights themselves are part of what's valuable about philosophy. And I think that that's probably right.
I think that this is indeed a very important difference between science and philosophy, and it can be directly explained by my distinction between personal and shared inquiry. If you remember from the previous episode, When inquiry is shared, we build towards a large interpersonal structure of beliefs. Each individual scientist contributes to this structure, and regardless of whether we measure scientific progress in terms of knowledge or understanding, or maybe something else, it doesn't matter whether the individual scientist knows or understands very much at all. In fact, it seems impossible for any individual scientist to understand the entire structure, or even close to the entire structure. It's simply too big and too intricate. So scientists are a bit like termites that build these incredibly complex structures, in the sense that no individual termite can actually appreciate the structure from their vantage point. All that matters is that the community as a whole, whatever this is, can appreciate the structure. So if we aim for knowledge, we aim for a sort of collective knowledge. And if we aim for understanding, we aim for collective understanding. And systemic disagreement tends to undermine this collective aim, because whenever there is systemic disagreement, there's no clear sense in which the community as a whole understands or knows anything at all. But philosophy is nothing like this. We aren't termites. As philosophers, we must grasp and understand the bigger picture, so we can't just rely on the testimony of others. We must ultimately appreciate the entirety of the structure ourselves. And I think that this can be explained by the fact that philosophical inquiry is personal. Each of us must understand our own philosophical structure of beliefs, because each of us, or at least most of us, will have different structures that arise from different nodes. But the question is, of course, what these nodes would be in philosophy. And here it would be good to return to my conversation with Wright. He gives a very telling anecdote of his disagreement with Timothy Williamson about the topic of vagueness and the Sorites paradox.
One thing that one should say quite early on is that philosophical disagreements are value-laden. So it's not as if we have a set of rules which we then bring to bear on questions in philosophy. And the correct thing to think is whatever pans out by the rules. Look at the dispute between Tim Williamson and me about vagueness, for example. You can see there's a difference in attitude, which is driving the whole thing. Tim thinks that the proven effectiveness of classical logic for a wide class of cases means that there's a presumption that we should give an account of vagueness, which conserves classical logic as a valid means of reasoning about vague statements. Okay. When you think that, you think, well, then there has to be a sharp cutoff in the Sorites series. Bivalence requires that. So you fashion a metaphysics to deliver, or you should do. Okay. You say, how can there be, what property is this that sharply disappears when I just lose a single hair? Okay. And now we need a story about that. Okay. So your value, the value placed on classical logic and semantics, drives a metaphysical conclusion. Maybe that can be worked out coherently and interestingly, maybe it can't. Coherence and interesting there are additional values that we bring to bear. Whereas I say, look, it's dotty to think that bivalence holds good for vague statements. We've absolutely no ground for thinking that. So I start from a kind of epistemic point of view, and then try to fashion a logic and a semantics which respects that. And lets us say, well, yeah, things peter out. At no point do things change dramatically. And at no point are they clearly less than they were before. You have to take seriously the idea of seamless transition. You start with red things, you finish with orange things. Okay. And there's no saying what goes on in between. No. And the right logic for that is, roughly speaking, intuitionist. Okay. But each of us can agree that on the assumptions made by the other and the values those assumptions express, we're doing reasonable philosophy. Okay, there's no obvious internal mistakes being made. So let that be so. People will line up one way or another. They'll like this view, they won't like that view. These likings are expressions of intellectual taste.
I really like this term, intellectual taste. I think that it might be an apt term for the kind of personal nodes that we have in philosophy. Wright actually returned to this point later on in our conversation.
We have intellectual tastes that work in philosophy. We have, there are tastes about what's interesting and what isn't. To a lesser extent, tastes about what's a good argument and what isn't. Again, I don't know how one adjudicates a dispute like that. I don't think probably you can adjudicate it. Well, here's a thought. We'd have to get clear about what the object of philosophy is. What are you trying to do? And it might be we could agree about that, and then in a certain sense sanction basic disagreements in philosophy. Okay, because at some level, what Wittgenstein called the discovery that gives philosophy peace, a memorable phrase in the investigations, maybe a personal thing. Okay, I'm now satisfied with this view. Okay, there are a few wrinkles, but I can live with those. Whereas you're not. You want to push further. Yeah.
I actually asked Goldberg what he thought of this idea that philosophical disagreements may turn on matters of intellectual taste. And this is what he said.
It's a lovely thought, and you're asking what I would describe as metaphilosophical questions that I care deeply about and have given some thought to as well. I'm sympathetic with the idea with BB's idea that we're trying to reach something like reflective equilibrium. I'm also sympathetic with the idea that there are, maybe this was the idea that Wright had when he told you that philosophical intuitions are matters of intellectual taste. I'm sympathetic with the idea that there's no starting point in philosophy whereby I can say to you, look, this is just the fact, you're not getting the fact, and so you're wrong about this. I tend to think that these things hang together and that there is a lot of flexibility in the kinds of systems one can develop.
Maybe you already know what I'm going to say. I think philosophical intuitions are in some sense personal, like fundamental moral convictions or aesthetic predilections. I think that they are indeed matters of intellectual taste. And while many philosophical intuitions are shared, we know very well that no philosophical theory can accommodate all these intuitions, so we must pick and choose. To go back to Wright's example of the disagreement between Williamson and himself on vagueness, Williamson takes the rules of classical logic as his philosophical nodes, whereas Wright's node is the intuition that there is such a thing as a seamless transition, that there's no sharp cutoff, no single hair that determines whether someone is balding or simply bald. And this intuition prompts him to reject classical logic, at least locally. But Wright recognizes that Williamson's view is internally coherent. It just makes a different trade-off. It presents a different structure. And at that point, the disagreement really does turn on a mere matter of taste. Goldberg expressed his agreement with this thought.
I think there's a lot of what I would call picture trading in philosophy. We develop a picture, we say, here's a picture. If somebody asks, well, what's the argument for that picture? There are some times where you can say things like, well, I can predict the following, and these predictions all turn out to be relatively nice. Alternative pictures may well predict a few of the things, but not all the things that mine does, but things that mine doesn't as well. And then if we ask ourselves which picture is better, I'm not clear on the kinds of arguments one can give beyond perhaps, well, maybe matters of taste. Maybe matters of taste is the way to think about this. Because when I think about why should you adopt my picture when your picture has another collection of virtues and drawbacks relative to mine, sometimes it does come down to life. This is the life that I want to lead, thinking about things this way. So maybe your comments about taste earlier are more, maybe I'm more amenable to them than I realized.
So this does seem very close to the model I've sketched for disagreement in personal inquiry. But maybe you're not so easily convinced. After all, how different is this really from scientific disagreement? Sure, there's some scientific disagreements that decidedly do not turn on matters of intellectual taste. But when we look at the more theoretical and speculative branches of science, it does start to look a bit like the pick and choose of intuitions that's common to philosophy. And then there's a related worry, which is that philosophy and science cover many of the same topics. So insofar as inquiries are individuated by their topic, it's unlikely that philosophy and science are entirely different inquiries. But I think that inquiries should be individuated by method, not by topic. And the scientific method is mostly an empirical method, whereas philosophy mostly isn't. And this, I think, is a crucial difference. For while I acknowledge that certain scientific disagreements could currently be about as speculative as philosophical disagreements, there is a possibility, if not a promise, that science will progress in such a way that what are now highly speculative and theoretical disagreements may be resolved by empirical evidence that we acquire a decade from now. Let me illustrate this distinction with a telling anecdote. In 1926, a Nobel Prize was awarded to a physician who had supposedly discovered a cancer-causing parasite. But then future evidence overturned these results, and this greatly embarrassed the nominating committee. So ever since, they've only awarded Nobel Prizes to scientists whose theories have been extensively corroborated by the evidence. And that's why many notable scientists who work in very theoretical areas actually don't live long enough for their theories to gain enough evidence for them to win a Nobel Prize. My point is that we hold out hope that our disagreements will ultimately be settled by the evidence, even if this may take longer than a lifetime. But forgive me for pointing out the obvious here. There is no Nobel Prize for philosophy, because there is no hope that our disagreements will be resolved by some further piece of evidence. That's just not how philosophy works. Perhaps that's because philosophical inquiry is often concerned with normative questions. Wright seems to think so. I asked him whether he thinks philosophy is primarily descriptive or normative.
I don't think we're describing, in the sense which you naturally understand that. There's not a reality that's already philosophically determinate, which we're struggling to articulate. I guess this is pragmatism. I think we're feeling our way into the shape of a view, set of proposals, with which we're comfortable and which resolves certain anxieties and singularities. But again, it'll be a value judgment if you've got that. But it may be, such are our philosophical prejudices and values, it may be that there is no account with which one feels totally happy. That there are always tensions or little incoherences, whatever you say. They're not to be ironed out. It's just a kind of predicament we have when we try to theorize about concepts which we've evolved for non-theoretical purposes in most cases. And then that's, if that's the case, well, that's as well to know. And now you can have a view that you prefer to others, but which it would be silly to say that this is the right account of the matter.
You might say, as both Wright and Goldberg seem to do, at least at times, that we should be skeptics and that we should just let go of the hope that we could ever come to believe our theories. But here's where I want to stress the analogy with other personal inquiries, because we don't do this when it comes to our beliefs about what's tasty or what's beautiful or what's morally right. And I think this might be because these are evaluative matters. But if Wright is correct, then philosophy also largely turns on evaluative matters. So we could interpret our philosophical judgments as normative judgments. This way, we don't have to be relativists or skeptics. We may appreciate that another philosophical system, like David Lewis's modal realism, is internally coherent, but we don't accept it because we think that the postulation of possible worlds as concrete entities is too counterintuitive. That's just not how we ought to think about possibility. So our task becomes to fashion an alternative system, but this will inevitably have its own drawbacks. And in the absence of any further objective constraints, the only question we can ask is what we ought to believe, in a kind of pragmatist sense perhaps. What beliefs should guide our reflections on the world and our place in it? We develop a normative Weltanschauung, a worldview, and there are no further facts, no objective sense in which it can be right or wrong, beyond, of course, the standard of internal coherence. Before concluding this episode, I must mention that there are still forms of collaboration, even if philosophy is ultimately a personal discipline. This goes beyond what we talked about earlier with people disagreeing with us at conferences. And it's important to mention this because this is where we can understand the public significance of the professional philosopher. So the first thing I must stress, which I also did in the last episode, is that there can still be epistemic outsourcing in personal inquiry. I asked Goldberg what this would look like in philosophy.
Here's a thought. Think about the process by which we educate and acculturate PhD students. So you have a PhD student, your PhD student is working on such and such. There are a few occasions, not many, but a few occasions when I say to a PhD student, I'm pretty confident that that's the royal road to disaster. That argument isn't going to work. I can anticipate you're going to find a problem. And some of my PhD students, not all of them, but some of them actually will, as it were, take my word for it. And they will actually say, okay, let me try something else. They'll take my word for it. They will not bother trying to make the argument out. They will assume that I was right in what I said. That's a kind of outsourcing, because I've done the work in thinking about this a lot, or actually having gone down the royal road to disaster myself and wasting 6 months of research time realizing that the argument isn't going to work. I think that's a kind of outsourcing. It's not as interesting a claim as it might seem, because what you really want is, do colleagues do this with one another? I think even there, maybe the answer is yes. I have colleagues I know, I can think about them right now. If I'm working on a topic, I want to know, what are the minefields in this topic? What are the mistakes that I'm most likely to make? Are there things that I ought to have in mind? Are there papers that I have to read? Merely taking it on my colleague's authority that there are papers in this topic that I have to read is a way of outsourcing, because she's already done the hard work and looking through the literature. I haven't done that. So in this respect, I think even in philosophy, we have outsourcing. It's not as sexy a claim as you might think, but I think it's true nevertheless.
When it comes to building our philosophical structures, we are helped by others who've tried to build similar structures and who might have encountered problems. Together with what Goldberg said earlier about the objections at conferences, these are two important ways in which there is some form of collaboration in philosophy. We rely on our critics to shoot down our theories, to pinpoint inconsistencies and such. But we also have less hostile forms of collaboration with those who have tried, or are trying currently, to build structures that happen to overlap with ours. Goldberg briefly mentioned the ideas of Helen Beebe earlier in our conversation. Beebe argues that all we can try to do in philosophy is build reflective equilibria. But there will always be many equilibria and no telling which one is the right one. Beebe connects this with a kind of skepticism and also seems to maintain that we can't rationally believe our own theories. But I think that given the personal nature of philosophy, we can. And that's why I think Beebe's account of philosophical progress is only partly right. But it's nevertheless informative, because it shows us what the public role of a philosopher should be. If philosophy were personal through and through, we may wonder why we keep funding philosophical research, because whichever advancements we would make would only be relevant to the individual who's doing the research and who's building their own private little structure. But instead, while everyone should ultimately settle on their own beliefs, the philosopher can help them enormously in doing so, by dedicating their lives to the project of articulating different systems of philosophical intuitions, building different equilibria. I suppose that on this view, the public task of a philosopher is just to develop as many structures as they can, and to make these structures as coherent as they can. From this public point of view, it doesn't matter whether the individual philosopher believes their own theories or not. Well, maybe it matters insofar as a philosopher might do a better job, be more invested, if they actually have skin in the game. But while I would be happy to say that the construction of all these equilibria can promote philosophical progress, I don't think it constitutes it. In fact, I don't think there's any progress at all from this public perspective. And that's because, well, again, philosophy is a personal inquiry. So whichever measure of progress we adopt, it should be a personal measure, not a shared one. In this podcast, I've built a small part of my very own structure, my own equilibrium, in which you can find theories of truth, rationality, peer disagreement, testimony, philosophical progress, and a bunch of other philosophical concepts. There are certainly some parts of overlap with other philosophers, for instance with Wright, as we've seen, when it comes to truth and the nature of philosophy. But even on these topics, we found plenty to disagree about. So really, there is no other philosopher with whom I share this structure. It's entirely my own. It's been a privilege to try to create it, but I can't say that I'm confident yet that it's necessarily coherent. Maybe if I manage to get a job, become a professional philosopher, then I can spend a large share of my life trying to refine it and expand on it, hopefully getting closer to my personal goal of attaining my very own understanding of these important matters. But if some university gives me a job, it wouldn't do so because it cares about this personal goal of mine. It wouldn't do so because of some conviction that out of all the thousands of structures that have been created throughout the history of our discipline, mine must be the right one. It would do so only because it would recognize that I'm good enough at coherently working through various philosophical problems in a way that others might appreciate and apply to their own structures. So it's not the product that counts, at least from this public perspective. It's the activity and sharing this activity with others, teaching others how to work through their own problems and create their own structures. It's the activity of doing philosophy that is the philosopher's bread and butter, more so than the idiosyncratic theories they happen to endorse by the end of it. And so I hope that you, my listener, have found something valuable in these episodes of Doing Philosophy, and that by listening to me working through all these philosophical topics, trying to set out and defend my theories, you've come to appreciate how all these notions of truth, rationality, disagreement, and the rest of them might hang together. Or maybe how not, if you find my theories utterly unconvincing. That would be somewhat less encouraging, but I would still take it. I wanted to end this series of episodes with a last word from Wright, a reminder that it is incredibly hard, if not impossible, to characterize all the different goals of philosophical inquiry, given that it can be so varied. But before I do so, I wanted to remind you one last time that I would love for this podcast to continue with other early career philosophers who will develop their very own theories. So once again, if you like this podcast and you want your work to be featured, please reach out to me at tomvkaspers@gmail.com. That's tomvkaspers@gmail.com. And I shouldn't forget to thank Sanford Goldberg and Crispin Wright for appearing on yet another episode. This has been Doing Philosophy. Thank you for listening.
So the hard question is the question about, as it were, the ultimate goals of philosophy. What kind of project is it? And I think that question is a bit like asking, what's the ultimate project for medicine? Promoting the health of people. And what does that consist in exactly? Nothing exactly, right? You know a healthy person when you see them, but health is nuanced and qualified and regional across the body and the mind and so on. There's no simple picture to have of that. Probably the same with philosophical health.